3 days ago, a pope disappeared. Not from the church, not from his faith, from his own schedule, from the eyes of the world. And when he came back, the people who saw his face said he looked like a man who had just been handed something he could never put down. What happened in those missing hours is what we are about to tell you, and we need you to stay with us through every word of this, because the ending, the thing he actually said when he reappeared, is going to change the way you understand everything that comes next. Pope Leo XIV left Rome in secret. No press corps, no announcement, no explanation from the Vatican, which, as you will soon understand, is itself the most telling detail of this entire story. He boarded a plane to Portugal and traveled by car, not helicopter, through the dark to a sanctuary that had been closed for the night. He met with 3 people whose combined knowledge of the Catholic Church's most protected archives spanned more than 60 years. He stayed for 4 hours, and the following morning he stood at an altar and said, out loud, on camera, in front of witnesses he had specifically chosen, that he had read something he was not supposed to have read, and that he was no longer willing to carry the weight of it alone. We are going to tell you exactly what that means. But first, you need to understand why this moment has been quietly building for an entire year, and why the people inside the Vatican who heard that homily went pale. Leo XIV, born Robert Francis Prevost in Chicago in 1955, was not supposed to be this kind of pope. When the College of Cardinals elected him on May 8, 2025, 17 days after the death of Pope Francis, they thought they were choosing a steady hand, an administrator, a man who knew the institution from the inside and would guide it forward without turbulence. He had spent decades rising through the Augustinian order, years in Peru doing missionary work in places where the church had no buildings, no bureaucracy, nothing except the faith people carried in their bodies. He became a bishop, then an archbishop, then one of the most powerful figures in the Vatican's administrative structure. He was an insider who spoke like an outsider, and the cardinals, many of them, convinced themselves that was a manageable quality. They were wrong. From the first weeks of his papacy, Leo XIV began doing something that no one could quite name, but everyone could feel. Small things at first. A phrase that landed harder than it needed to. A document that went slightly further than precedent allowed. Restructuring the Vatican's communications office in a way that removed institutional lifers and replaced them with people who had done actual pastoral work. And then larger things. A document on synodality that went further than anything Francis had published. Quiet outreach to Eastern Orthodox leadership that suggested a reunification conversation more serious than anything in living memory. A pattern, architectural in its precision, of moving towards something that had not yet revealed itself, until 3 days ago. Here is what you need to know about the third secret of Fatima, and please stay with us through this part, because what Leo XIV found is not what you think it is, and the difference matters enormously. In 1917, 3 children in a field in Portugal described receiving messages from an apparition of the Virgin Mary. The messages came in parts. 2 of the 3 were shared with the world relatively quickly. The third was sealed and sent to Rome, where it sat in a protected archive, unread by most of the world, for decades. In the year 2000, under Pope John Paul II, the Vatican officially released what it called the third secret. It described a symbolic vision of a bishop in white climbing a hill, falling under fire, being killed. The Vatican's interpretation was that this vision referred to the 1981 assassination attempt on John Paul II. Third secret revealed. Case closed, or so the world was told. But here is what never fully went away. For years, a persistent thread of Vatican observers, theologians, and even certain cardinals maintained quietly, carefully, but consistently, that what was released in 2000 was not the complete text. That alongside the symbolic vision, there existed a separate element, a written statement, specific words attributed directly to the apparition itself, recorded by the children of Fatima, and then sealed away under protocols so extraordinary that only a handful of people in each pontificate ever accessed them. Not one pope who read it chose to release it. Not one. Until now. We need you to understand the weight of that sentence. Multiple popes. Multiple pontificates spanning decades. Every single one of them read what was in that archive, and every single one of them locked it away again. That is not a coincidence. That is a decision made and remade, generation after generation, by the most powerful figures in one of the oldest institutions on Earth. Leo XIV received a private briefing in early May of this year, right around the first anniversary of his election. The briefing did not come from the usual channels. It came from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and it was accompanied by a file that had not been opened in over 30 years. He read it, and something in him shifted in a way that apparently could not be shifted back. Within weeks, 3 individuals who had been sending requests to the Vatican since the earliest days of his pontificate, requests that had been politely filed away by mid-level staff who treated them as routine petitions, found themselves on their way to Portugal. One of them was a retired Portuguese bishop in his 80s who had served in a sensitive archival role under both John Paul II and Benedict XVI. One was a woman, a theologian specializing in Marian apparitions, which is itself significant in a context where women have historically been kept at significant distance from the Church's most protected spaces. And the third, the detail that made Vatican insiders go very still when they heard it, was a man who had been present in the room when the decision was made about what to release in 2000 and what to withhold. A man who had carried the weight of that decision for more than 25 years. These 3 people had been asking to speak with the Pope. Leo XIV had them meet him at Fatima in the middle of the night after the sanctuary had closed, in the Chapel of the Apparitions. 4 hours. We want you to sit with that number for a moment. Papal private audiences are measured in minutes. Even extended working sessions with heads of state rarely exceed 90 minutes. Leo XIV spent 4 hours in that chapel with 3 people whose combined knowledge of the most protected archive in Catholicism stretched across 6 decades. Whatever was said in that room, it was not brief, it was not simple, and it was not, based on everything that followed, comfortable. What emerged from the accounts of that night is this. The material Leo XIV had reviewed contained 2 elements. The first was the additional textual component that Vatican observers had long suspected existed. Specific words, not a vision, not a symbol, but a written statement attributed directly to the apparition itself, recorded by the children of Fatima, and then separated from the symbolic portion that was eventually released to the world. The second was something in some ways more disturbing, a systematic record of the decision-making process behind the suppression. Not just the fact that it was withheld, but the reasoning, the debates, the specific concerns that led successive pontificates to conclude, again and again, that this text could not be made public. And here is the part that changes everything. Those concerns were not primarily theological. They were institutional. They were about what the complete text would imply about the relationship between the Catholic Church as an organization and the tradition of direct divine communication that the Church officially endorses, but has always been extremely careful to keep at a controlled distance. Prophecy, in its raw form, creates problems for institutions. It implies divine communication that bypasses hierarchy. It creates expectations that are specific and therefore falsifiable. It generates the kind of response that large, ancient institutions find genuinely destabilizing, not because the people managing that response are villains, but because they are stewards of something enormous and fragile and old, and they understand what happens when it fractures. The man in that chapel who had been present for the original decision reportedly wept. The following morning, Leo XIV celebrated Mass at the Fatima shrine publicly. He had not announced it in advance. The crowd was small, a few hundred pilgrims, some sanctuary staff, local clergy notified overnight. There were cameras because the shrine has permanent media infrastructure. He spoke for approximately 14 minutes without notes. And then he said it. He said the Church has a responsibility to truth that does not expire. He said what has been entrusted to this institution in faith is not ours to manage for the sake of comfort. He said the mercy of heaven is not served by the caution of institutions, and the time for certain cautions has passed. And then, with cameras rolling, he said this: I have read what I was not supposed to have read. I have heard what I was not supposed to have heard, and I am no longer willing to pretend that the weight of this belongs only to me. A sitting pope, standing at Fatima, telling the world that he had accessed something unauthorized and that he intended to do something about it. The Vatican's response arrived by mid-morning. They called it a contextual clarification. It said, and this is the complete substance of what it communicated, that the Holy Father's words reflected his personal pastoral engagement with the living tradition of Marian spirituality and should be understood in that spirit. Read that again. They did not say he misspoke. They did not say the homily was taken out of context. They produced a sentence specifically engineered to say nothing while appearing to say something, and every person in the world who reads Vatican communications for a living noticed immediately. What Leo XIV is apparently preparing to do, based on the accounts we have and the signals he has been sending, is something no pope has done before. Not a formal Vatican document, not a carefully orchestrated press event with preemptive theological interpretation designed to neutralize the content before anyone has had a chance to engage with it. Something more direct, a letter, possibly, a homily, a form of address that bypasses the institutional apparatus entirely and places the complete Fatima text directly before the people it was, in his apparent view, always meant for. There are people in the Vatican who understand exactly what this would mean and are genuinely alarmed. Not because they are cynical protectors of power, but because they have studied what happens historically when prophetic material reaches large communities without institutional mediation. The destabilization can be severe. The fractures can take generations to repair. These are serious concerns held by serious people, and Leo XIV is not unaware of them. He has simply made a different calculation. The argument he appears to be advancing is that the information environment of 2026 is so fundamentally different from the one in which the original suppression decision was made that the old logic has inverted. Controlling the narrative no longer protects the institution. It destabilizes it, because the vacuum of official silence is filled with something far more damaging than the truth would be. Every fragment that leaks, every credible rumor, every persistent theological whisper compounds into a story that the institution can no longer shape or contain. The attempt to manage the message has become the thing that makes the message unmanageable. One of the people who was present in that chapel at Fatima said this afterward, and we believe the account is accurate. He said, "He didn't come to us with questions. He came to us with something he had already decided. He wanted us to know that. He wanted witnesses. He wanted witnesses." Think about what that means. A pope who traveled in secret in the middle of the night to one of the most charged prophetic sites in modern Catholic history, not to deliberate, not to be persuaded by people who knew more than he did, but to be seen in a decision already made, to have human eyes in the room, to be witnessed. In 1917, 3 children stood in a field in Portugal. They were 10 and 8 and 7 years old. They had no authority, no training, nothing except the experience of having been present for something that altered them permanently and that they spent the rest of their lives trying to find words for. The Church spent more than a century deciding what to do with what they received. 1 year ago, a 69-year-old Augustinian priest from Chicago accepted a weight that no preparation fully anticipates. He has spent this year doing something rarely seen in this chair, learning in public, moving towards something, piece by piece, with the patience and precision of a man who knows exactly where he is going and is choosing his steps carefully. 3 days ago, he went to Fatima. He came back different, and he went there specifically so that someone would see it happen. In the next 48 to 72 hours, the Vatican is expected to issue a more formal response. We will break it down word by word because, as this story has made clear, the words matter, and so does the space between them. If additional accounts surface from people in that room, we will bring them to you with the same sourcing standards we have maintained throughout. And if Leo XIV does what the signals suggest he is building toward, if he stands before the world and releases in full what multiple popes chose to seal away, if he says out loud what that archive contains and always contained, we will walk through every word of it with you. The meeting at Fatima happened 3 days ago. What it set in motion has not finished moving. This story is not over. In almost every way that matters, it is just beginning.